Chapter 12 of Charles Sumner, the Scholar in Politics, by Archibald Grimké. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Red Spirits and Grey. A truly momentous year was 1856 in the political annals of the Union. The strife between freedom and slavery was raging the while in Kansas and at the seat of the federal government at Washington, where it culminated in the assault on Sumner. It is memorable also as marking the last triumph at the polls of the slave power in America and the first appearance of the new Northern Party in national politics. This year the Republican Party made its debut on the national stage and swept the free states with the magnificent courtesy of more than 1 1/3 million of votes. If the new party of freedom failed to elect its candidates, Fremont and Dayton, neither did the old party of slavery succeed in securing for its candidates, Buchanan and Breckinridge, a majority of the polls by something like nearly 400,000 votes. The long primacy of the South and the overlordship of the slave power in the Union drew almost visibly after this Pyrrhic victory to their violent and tremendous downfall. Seeing how matters must conclude for it and its ill-gotten gains, should the excitement growing out of the repeal of the Missouri Compromise continue in the North with no abatement of its energy, the slave power hit upon a bold, bad, and desperate device to compose it. This was no other than the famous or infamous judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of Dred Scott, which declared the unconstitutionality of the Missouri Compromise. If that act was ab initio null and void, it followed plainly enough that its repeal could not have worked any legal detriment to the interest of the free states in the upper division of the Louisiana Territory. If they had nothing under the arrangement of 1820, and the act of 1854 took that nothing away from them, what great consequence had they suffered because of this sort of congressional addition and subtraction? But the North was not deceived by the solemn and partisan jugglery of the majority of the judges on the Supreme Bench upon the subject. Its moral sense was besides shocked by the bold inhumanities of the decision directed against the Negro race. For deep within the Northern heart, buried to be sure within labyrinthine selfishness and pride, there was an idea, a feeling that the black man did have rights which white men were bound to respect, the obiter dicta of the Supreme Court to the contrary notwithstanding. The suspicion, too, that the highest judicature of the land, one of the coordinate branches of the national government, had only acted a part assigned it by the slave power, served to add fuel to the flames of agitation which the authoritative voice of that tribunal was evoked to allay. And so, after all this shrewd calculation, the anti-Nebraska excitement was not composed, and it went rapidly, in fact, from bad to worse. The prohibitory legislation of 1820, torn from the statute book by the slave power, was not blotted at the same time from the breasts of Northern freemen. Congress and the Supreme Court had not power to erase the great fiat of liberty written there. The unconquerable temper with which free Kansas rose with the emergency with which it encountered the aggressions and outrages of the army of slavery, backed as that army was by the whole authority of the national executive, proved the folly and futility of the repeal, proved also the folly and futility of the squatter sovereignty dogma as an instrument for introducing slavery into the territories. When the slave leaders perceived that this much vaunted dogma was unequal to the introduction of slavery into the territories, it was promptly discarded by them, and another better adapted to the accomplishment of their purpose selected in its stead. The other was Calhoun's supreme dogma of the self-extension of slavery under the Constitution, as Benton phrased it, together with its corollary, the obligation of Congress to protect by law the slaveholder in the enjoyment of his constitutional right to slave labor against a hostile territorial majority. Theretofore the Southern shibboleth had been, Congress has no power to legislate on the subject of slavery in the territories. Now it became the duty of Congress to safeguard the institution within the territories. Not until a territory had attained to statehood, according to this latest position of the South, could the principle of popular sovereignty operate to exclude a master and his slaves. Stephen A. Douglas was altogether too great and selfish a politician to enact the role of a mere tool. If he consented to serve the slave power, it was doubtless because he calculated that he could serve self at the same time, could advance designs of his upon the presidency. He knew that his popular sovereignty doctrine measured the full length of his political tether. Not an inch beyond the principles set up by him in 1854 in solution of the territorial problem did he dare to venture. To shift his position, taken then to this last and desperate pretension of the South, would be passing politically upon himself a death sentence. And Douglas was not of the self-renouncing kind. He loved power too greedily to imperil his leadership at the North, even to please the slave power. The little giant drew defiantly and proudly off from his Southern allies on the Lecompton issue. On that issue, the erstwhile united and invincible Democratic party ran sharply upon a question which was to shake it to its center and eventually split it in two. In this posture of affairs between Douglas and fellow Democrats at the South, an old prophecy of Calhoun found fulfillment. For Northern representatives, even so audacious and powerful a public man as was Douglas, were, when they came to act, looking not to the South but to the North for their political cue. Douglas, puissant as he undoubtedly was in Illinois, dared not to bow before the imperious will of the slave power at this juncture. Willing or unwilling, he had to move with the currents of public opinion in his own state. Indeed, he owed his reelection to the Senate over Lincoln, a few months later to his courageous and uncompromising tone in the Lecompton debate. The wrath of the South burned hotly against its old Confederates in aggression and wrong. In obedience to its behest, he was deposed from the chairmanship of the Senate Committee on Territories, and stood, it was bruited, in some danger of being read out of the Democratic party. Events were plainly getting beyond the control of the politicians, escaping as from Pandora's box on every hand, to the confusion and discomfiture of the compromisers at the North and those at the South. It was an instance of the irrepressible fermentation of contrary ideas working from within outwardly in obedience to rooted social differences and antagonisms between the sections. The South was the victim of a system of labor which early withdrew from it the power of choice, and then drove it forward blindly by the force of an inexorable necessity upon its fate. The North was likewise the creature of an industrial principle whose resultant interests and institutions slowly took away from it the power of self-determination in its conflicts with slave labor, and impelled it in a line of social expansion as distinct from that of the South as is light from darkness, civilization from barbarism. Never to any wide extent were the free states abolitionists. They opposed slavery so far only as slavery menaced their interests, and no further. They loved the Union. They had no love for the slave. To preserve the one, they were ever disposed to sacrifice the freedom of the other. But happily for the slave, his freedom could not be immolated utterly on the altar of the Union, without entailing upon his immolators, to a certain extent, a loss of political power. And this possible consequence to themselves served to withhold the Northern people from abandoning him entirely to his wretched fate. From the first, therefore, the passion of the free states for sectional ascendancy pushed them gradually away from the South and toward the slave. As the contest for political supremacy waxed between the sections, the line of separation lengthened between the North and the South, and lessened between the North and the slave, until in due time liberty and the Union grew to be one and inseparable. But this converging of the sectional interests of the free states and of freedom to the slave upon a single point was a long and tumultuous process, as the reader well knows. The thing which the South demanded, the North could not yield, and that which the North asked for, the South could not grant. The South demanded more slave territory, more slave states, while the North was compelled in self-defense to resist all further extension of slavery to the soil of the Republic, and to oppose the admission of more slave states into the Union. Certainly the two sections were not fed with the same food, for what might be meat to the one was apt to prove poison to the other. A startling episode like John Brown and Harper's Ferry was the flashlight by which destiny revealed to themselves and to each other the hearts of those natural and irrepressible enemies. In these circumstances it did not take that wise man Abraham Lincoln long to discover for the Northern people that their Union could not endure permanently half slave and half free. The discovery of that momentous fact had been made by 70 years of experiment and conflict. This truth during that long period had deepened and spread at the South. It had deepened and spread at the North, more slowly to be sure, but with not less certainty or constancy than in the other half of the country. The logic of Southern aggression tended to make the Union all slave, that of Northern resistance to make it all free. The sectionalism of the Douglas wing of the Democratic party differed in degree only from the sectionalism of the Republican party. Neither would go the whole length of Southern demand. Both went part way, the latter stopping in this respect considerably short of the former, but the same force which arrested the one halted the other also. That force was the growing consciousness of the people of the free states of deep and abiding differences and antagonisms between the interests and institutions of their section and those of the slave states. But to fail the South at this juncture in one particular was to fail it altogether. So at least reasoned her leaders. To throw her back, with her inferior colonizing resources, upon the dogma of popular sovereignty as an instrument for opening new regions for the extension of slavery was not the deed of a friend but of a foe. Douglas, therefore, and his faction, the South, grew to hate with a bitterness hardly less than that with which it hated Lincoln and his party. Both were denounced as enemies which no Southern man true to his section could support. In the Charleston Convention, the two wings of the Democratic party collided in a contest of unbridled passion. The South demanded as a sine qua non to any further union between the party North and the party South the incorporation into the party platform of the dogma that slavery extends itself under the Constitution to the national territories, together with its corollary that Congress is bound to safeguard by law the human property of slaveholders within the territories, popular sovereignty to the contrary notwithstanding. But an act of such self-stultification and madness the Douglas men dared not commit. Their refusal to place the party upon this Southern plank was the signal for the disruption of the Democratic organization, which was speedily followed by the dissolution of the Union. But it is time to return to the story of Sumner's life. He had not resumed his seat in the Senate many months before his collisions with its slave masters began anew. One of the earliest of these skirmishes he had with Mason of Virginia over a memorial from Mr. Frank B. Sanborn of Concord, Massachusetts, representing to the Senate how he had been treated by certain persons acting under orders from one of its special committees. Mr. Sanborn's case grew out of John Brown's raid into Virginia and an attempt on the part of the Senate committee appointed to investigate the matter to compel him to testify touching his knowledge of the expedition. As Mr. Sanborn was not disposed to go willingly to Washington, the sergeant-at-arms of the Senate deputed certain persons to take him into custody and convey him to the Capitol. This the deputies on the evening of April 3, 1860, proceeded to do. They succeeded partially in the accomplishment of their purpose, viz., in getting Mr. Sanborn into their possession and slipping handcuffs upon him, and were about to slip him into a carriage when, owing to the presence of mind and courage of a sister, the friendly succor of neighbors, and the efficacy of the habeas corpus, they were finally foiled and forced to release their prisoner. These circumstances were recited to the Senate by Mr. Sumner, who presented the memorial, whereupon Mason, who was the chairman of the Harper's Ferry Committee, moved that the memorial be rejected. This brought Mr. Sumner to his feet with the remark, "The senator moves that the memorial be rejected," and he makes this unaccustomed motion with a view to establish a precedent in such a case. I feel it my duty to establish a precedent also in this case by entering an open, unequivocal protest against such an attempt. Sir, an ancient poet said of a judge in hell that he punished first and heard afterwards. Casti Godque auditque, and permit me to say, the senator from Virginia on this occasion takes a precedent from that court. Of course, Mr. Mason, who professed not to be used to such language within or without the Senate, was terribly shocked by this sulphurous and burning allusion to his motion to reject the memorial of Mr. Sanborn. Sumner was not content with striking when struck, as in the instance just given, but he would take the initiative as well. And when this he did, the slave power had occasion to think of him with emotion for many a day afterward. His long disability and absence from his post had not abated a tittle of his hatred of slavery, or of its domination in the Union. That hatred and the puritanical sternness and aggressiveness which characterized his opposition to the slave power had, if anything, increased during those years of illness. In public life there was no man who so hated slavery as did Sumner. Certainly not Seward, nor Chase, nor Hale, nor Wilson, nor even Giddings. Sumner's hatred of it as a political evil surpassed theirs, while to this unequaled hostility was added an intolerance and abhorrence of it as a moral wrong, felt only by such men as Garrison, Phillips, Theodore D. Weld, James G. Birney, Eliezer Wright, Frederick Douglass, Parker Pillsbury, and Stephen S. Foster. He was in truth in 1860 the incarnation of iron will and iron convictions on the subject of slavery, political and moral. All this appears in that grand and terrible philippic entitled The Barbarism of Slavery, delivered by him in the Senate June 4, 1860. In this speech, which was made on the bill for the admission of Kansas as a free state, Sumner condensed the whole horror and curse of slavery, reflected its image with a fierce realism and scorn which was worthy of Garrison himself. In the early years of the Republic, it was general, almost universal, in the slave states to look upon slavery as a political evil and a moral wrong. Slave masters were among the loudest and sincerest in denunciation of it as such, among the most earnest of the early abolitionists who hoped for its ultimate extinction, but owing to several causes of a political economic nature, discussed by the writer in his Life of William Lloyd Garrison under the caption, The Hour and the Men, Chapter 4, page 92, into which he begs to refer the interested reader. This early expectation in regard to slavery failed to be realized. The evil, on the contrary, entered upon a period of extraordinary social and political expansion and power. And with this change there was inaugurated another. The early toleration of the South gave place in time to passionate attachment to the monster. It became no longer an evil, a wrong to be extirpated, but a positive good to be cherished, as Calhoun proclaimed it on the floor of the Senate in 1837. Presently devotion to slavery grew to be general through the South. In 1860, when Sumner made his speech on the barbarism of slavery, it was practically universal. The slave states no more blushed for their social system, but by the mouths of their leaders vaunted it rather as the most solid and durable foundation on which to rear free and stable political institutions, and as the cornerstone of our republican edifice, as a great moral, social, and political blessing, as the normal condition of human society, as ennobling to both races, the white and the black, etc., etc., etc. Sumner's speech was in part an elaborate and merciless exposure of the groundlessness of these assumptions. He exposed the barbarism of slavery under the two heads of the character of slavery and of the character of slave masters. In the preparation of his argument, Sumner had evidently acquainted himself with the entire body of the laws and the literature bearing on the subject. He came with chapter, section, and page of the Black Book of Slavery at his finger's end. The whole awful record he unrolled during the 4 hours that he held the attention of the Senate. The enormities of the slave code and the enormities of the slave character filed in a long and terrific procession before the Senate and the country. Slave masters were made to see themselves in the dehumanizing monster which they were hugging as they appeared to the moral sense of the age. His exhibition of the character of slave masters in congressional history was as pungent, effective, and thorough as truth and the arts of the orator could make it. With the Congressional Globe in one hand, he drew aside with the other the curtain of years, a curtain which concealed a series of shameful and turbulent scenes, such as have rarely disgraced the annals of parliamentary proceedings. Just as the records had caught the lords of the lash, pictures of vulgarity and violence, they were reproduced with their swagger, their insolence and oaths, with their bowie knives, their bludgeons and firearms, defiant of the laws of debate, of decency, and of the deity alike. And this stern exposure he fitly closed with a view of the melancholy unconsciousness which constitutes one of the distinctive features of this barbarism. Next to the unconsciousness of childhood, observed the orator, is the unconsciousness of barbarism. The real barbarian is unconscious as an infant, and the slave master shows much of the same character. No New Zealander exults in his tattoo, no savage of the northwest coast exults in his flathead, more than the slave master of these latter days. Always, of course, with honorable exceptions, exults in his unfortunate condition. The slave master hugs his disgusting practice as the Carib of the Gulf hugged cannibalism, and Brigham Young now hugs polygamy. The delusion of the goiter is repeated. This prodigious swelling of the neck, nothing less than a loathsome wallet of flesh, pendulous upon the breast, and sometimes so enormous that the victim is unable to support the burden, crawls along the ground, is common to the population on the slopes of the Alps, but accustomed to this deformity, the sufferer comes to regard it with pride, as the slave masters with us unable to support their burden, and crawling along the ground regard slavery, and it is said that those who have no swelling are laughed at and called goose-necked. If the speech 4 years before roused all the dark and malignant passions of the South against him, this one could do no less, for while it did not single out by name particular representatives of slavery for punishment as did the former, its general scope and overwhelming effect carried its argument and charge of colossal guilt and iniquity home to the individual consciousness of each as well as all. He had attacked the whole. He had attacked every mother's son of the slave oligarchy. The slave masters of the Senate and House were metaphorically and literally ready, during the progression of the terrible philippic and at its conclusion, to tear the defender of humanity to pieces. A newspaper writer sketched at the time the scenes in the chamber during the delivery of the speech. Mr. Breckinridge remained all the time, wrote an occasional correspondent of the Chautauqua Democrat, and sat with an open book in his hands, pretending to read, but his eyes wandered from the page, and with a frown upon his brow he finally gazed at the speaker till he closed. Jefferson Davis pretended to be reading the Globe, but it was plain to be seen by the heading of the paper that it was upside down. Wigfall seemed in torment. He listened respectfully a while, and then glided silently around from one senator to another, and conferred in whisper. He seemed to be hatching mischief, but the grave shake of the head of the older senators doubtless kept this uneasy, restless desperado quiet. Hunter sat like a rock immovable, and listened respectfully to the whole. Not a muscle moved upon his placid face to denote what was going on in his mind. Toombs heard the most of it quietly, and with as much of a don't-care look as his evil passions would permit. Near the close, Cheap's gray Mason came in and took his seat and commenced writing a letter. He evidently intended to show the galleries that Sumner was too small for him to notice, but he soon found a seat in a distant part of the hall, and an easy position, where he sat gloomily scowling upon the orator till he sat down. When the speech was about half through, Keitt, the accomplice of Brooks in his attempted assassination of Mr. Sumner, came in and took a seat near Senator Hammond. For a while he sat gazing about the galleries, evidently to notice the dramatic effect of his presence upon the audience there, but few seemed to notice him. By degrees he began to pay attention to the speech. Curry of Alabama and Lamar, Mississippi, members of the other house, though Southerners of the straightest sect, could not conceal their delight in the oratory and classic and scholarly feast before them. They were scholars and orators themselves, and could appreciate an intellectual treat, though the sentiments were so obnoxious. On the Republican side, breathless attention prevailed. Those who immediately surrounded the senator were Mr. Wilson, Senator Bingham, John Hickman, Preston King, and Solomon Foote. Mr. Seward sat in his usual seat, and scarcely moved during the delivery of the great speech. By the time Sumner had finished speaking, the slave masters of the Senate had hit upon an answer, and this Mr. Chestnut of South Carolina was selected to make, and this was the answer: Mr. President, after the extraordinary, though characteristic speech just uttered in the Senate, it is proper that I assign the reason for the position we are now inclined to assume. After ranging over Europe, crawling through the back door to whine at the feet of British aristocracy, craving pity and reaping a rich harvest of contempt, the slanderer of states and men reappears in the Senate. We had hoped to be relieved from the outpouring of such vulgar malice. We had hoped that one who had felt, though ignominiously he failed to meet the consequences of a former insolence, would have become wiser, if not better, by experience. In this I am disappointed, and I regret it. Mr. President, in the heroic ages of the world, men were deified for the possession and the exercise of some virtues: wisdom, truth, justice, magnanimity, courage. In Egypt also, we know, they deified beasts and reptiles, but even that bestial people worshipped their idols on account of some supposed virtue. It has been left for this day, for this country, for the abolitionists of Massachusetts to deify the incarnation of malice, mendacity, and cowardice. Sir, we do not intend to be guilty of aiding in the apotheosis of pusillanimity and meanness. We do not intend to contribute by any conduct on our part to increase the devotees at the shrine of this new idol. We know what is expected and what is desired. We are not inclined again to send forth the recipient of punishment, howling through the world, yelping fresh cries of slander and malice. These are the reasons which I feel it due to myself and others to give to the Senate and the country why we have quietly listened to what has been said and why we can take no other notice of the matter. To this characteristic Southern answer, Mr. Sumner, gaining the floor with difficulty, replied briefly thus, addressing the President: only one word. I expose today the barbarism of slavery. What the Senator has said in reply I may well print as an additional illustration. That is all. Mr. Chestnut's wrathful little performance was charged to the muzzle with explosives, with savage and intolerable hate. It was the typical Southern answer to anti-slavery arguments, with the bludgeon and the bowie knife left out. But if they were left out, it was for the occasion only, as an incident which occurred on the fourth day after the speech evinced. About 6 o'clock in the afternoon of that day, Mr. Sumner was called on by a stranger who introduced himself as a Southerner and slaveholder, and demanded of the slanderer of states and men an explanation of his speech, and avowed his intention to hold him responsible therefor. But the defender of humanity, though an ardent peace man, who eschewed war and the duel and all appeals to force for the settlement of differences between nation and man, as unworthy of a Christian age, nevertheless believed with no less ardor in the right and the duty of self-defense when put to it by bullies and assassins. He therefore ordered the ruffian to leave the room, which he did, but not before breathing out vengeance against the author of the barbarism of slavery, and threatening to return with 3 others who had come with him from Virginia expressly to hold the orator responsible. After having this notice of intended violence served upon him, Mr. Sumner sent for his colleague Henry Wilson, who promptly repaired to the lodgings of his friend, and while there a second unknown man called to see Sumner, but when he was apprised that the object of his call was not alone, he suspiciously declined to enter. A few hours later 3 strange men called, but when they were informed that they could not see the Massachusetts senator alone, they too turned away with the sanguinary message that they would call again in the morning for a private interview, and if they did not get it, they would cut his blank throat before the next night. Such a murderous message was not ignored by the friends of Mr. Sumner. On the contrary, Anson, Burlingame, and John Sherman slept that night in a room opening into the bedroom of their friend, prepared to teach Southern fire-eaters that if blood was to be spilt, Northern men proposed to be on hand at the next spilling appointment and join in the operation. Nothing, however, came of the matter. The bloody-minded visitors failed to repeat their call, either that night or the next morning. The noise of the incident reaching the ears of the mayor of Washington, that official requested Mr. Sumner to make an affidavit of the facts, but this, owing to a want of faith in the magistrates of that city, he declined to do. The original offender, a well-known office-holder of Virginia, was at length discovered and brought to Mr. Sumner's room by the mayor. The fellow apologized for the part he had taken in the affair, but denied all knowledge of the others who had left the sanguinary message. Without Sumner's being aware of it at the time, faithful friends stood watch over him at night and attended him as a bodyguard between his lodgings and the Senate. This latter service was performed by Kansas citizens under the command of Augustus Wattles, from the door of the House to the door of the Senate, and vice versa. All unknown to the object of their solicitude, these determined men followed him day after day with revolvers in hand. The speech had other results. Coming as it did about the beginning of the presidential campaign, it produced a sensation among the army of politicians and editors who attach higher value to party success than to everlasting principles. Many there were among this always too numerous class, and who perhaps have never been more so than during the period of the national canvass of 1860, regretted the delivery of the speech and bewailed the fancied harm it would inflict upon the Republican party in the contest. But as time passed and the contest waxed, the squad of croakers and compromisers, who were troubled and anxious about everything under the sun in the world of politics except freedom and for the slave, learned that the speech had not injured the chances of their party's success, but had instead really improved them with the common people, began to sing another tune in regard to it and its brave and eloquent author. The speech was printed as a campaign document in several large editions and sent broadcast over the free states while the author was in urgent demand as a speaker throughout the North. In Massachusetts he spoke many times during the canvass, and in New York once when he made a powerful speech on the origin, necessity, and permanence of the Republican Party, in which he restated the argument against slavery, but with this single exception, possibly from fear of a relapse, he did not speak out of his own state, though again and again importuned to do so by Republican committees from Maine to Illinois. The alarmist and loudmouthed friends of the Union converted the barbarism of slavery to their own mischievous purposes. In it they professed to descry the real but concealed character and aims of the Republican Party, the Black Republican Party, as it was called, to make it odious with the people of the free states. The dissolution of the dear Union, in the event of the triumph of that party at the then approaching elections, was held up to frighten the North into a refusal to support the Republican candidates. A vote for Lincoln was in sooth a vote for disunion, and to Sumner's speech the alarmists pointed for confirmation of that gloomy vaticination. Here is one way in which the New York Herald, taking the speech for a text, artfully held up the terrible consequences to the country of Republican success. But there is one characteristic of this speech which is in perfect accordance with the policy of the Black Republican Party in the present campaign. The bloody and terrible results which must ensue if that party succeeds in getting possession of the federal government are kept carefully out of view. John Brown's practice is taught, but there is no word of John Brown. The social condition of 15 populous, rich, and powerful states is to be revolutionized, but not a hint of possibility of resistance on their part, or of the reactive effect of such resistance upon the aggressive North, is dropped. Whoever else trimmed and tacked his principles and convictions to weather the gusty currents of the times, Sumner did not. No stress or fury of the political elements, no impending peril and disaster could make him turn from his course and fly before the storm. Throughout the campaign, which terminated in the election of Lincoln, he held his undeviating way toward the restoration of the Republic to its original anti-slavery character, when freedom was national and slavery sectional, to the emancipation of the government from the domination of the slave power, to the total annihilation of the idea wherever the jurisdiction of the Constitution extended, whether in the territories or the District of Columbia, or on the high seas under the national flag, that man can hold property in man. The uncompromising spirit which characterized his course before the elections characterized it not less afterwards, when the anti-election alarmists doubled their activity and the apprehensions of the friends of the Union at the same time. In that period of dreadful suspense which intervened between Lincoln's election and the beginning of secession, it seemed almost as if the whole North was in a panic of fright and ready to suggest or support any concession to the South in order to save the Union. Give, give, give was in the mouths of the most powerful politicians and leaders of the victorious party of freedom. Lincoln, Seward, Thurlow, Weed, and company were in the mood for making extraordinary concessions to the South and sacrifices of the anti-slavery principles of their party to induce Jefferson Davis, Howell Cobb, William L. Yancey, and company to refrain from breaking up the precious Union and brotherhood of right and wrong, for which the government, as organized and administered, had stood for 70 years. At every door and on every brow sat gloom and apprehension. An appalling uncertainty was indeed scaring statesmen and people. But the thoughts and words of Sumner were not those of the terrified people and leaders. There was light on but one difficult and perilous path, the path of duty, of national righteousness. In this one true way he confidently planted his feet. Thick fogs were around him. A wild, chaotic sea of doubt and danger encircled him and the country, but he hesitated not, nor swerved to the right hand or to the left, to find an easier and safer way of escape. Straight on up he climbed, calling through the rising darkness and tumult to his groping countrymen to follow. Nothing is settled which is not right. Peace, ever-enduring peace, comes only to that people who dare to put down sin and lift up righteousness, rang firm and clear from him in this tremendous crisis in the life of the nation. He was in very truth then the faithful one. He saw the supreme peril which impended over the Republic, and felt assured that it was not in secession and civil war, but in the timidity and selfishness which, in order to avert these, were disposing the Northern people and their leaders to compromise the principles of liberty, inclining then to make fresh and disastrous concessions to slavery. If his anxiety was great, his vigilance, earnestness, and activity rose to the high level demanded of him in the emergency. No uncertainty vexed his conscience or disturbed his courage. Whatever questions admitted of conciliatory treatment, the slavery question admitted of no back-down on the part of the free states. Not another inch of concession should be made by them to the evil power which had devoured their peace and trodden down their best interests, and which no surrender, short of absolute and unconditional, could permanently pacify. If disunion and civil war were crouching in the rough way of the nation's duty, the nation must not turn aside to avoid them. It ought, on the contrary, resolutely, regardless of consequences, to seek first to establish itself in justice and liberty. This bravely and finally done, he did not doubt that then every other good thing would be added to it. Seeing how matters were with people and politicians, and the temptations which were assailing them through their fears to betray liberty to her ancient foe, Sumner seized every opportunity which came to him to fix their wavering faith, to steady their faltering purpose, to bring the government back to its earlier and better policy, when freedom and not slavery was national. His timely lecture on Lafayette, the Faithful One, was among the potent instrumentalities employed by him in achieving this result. In exalting Lafayette and unrolling the splendid record of his glorious life, where fidelity to liberty shone conspicuous and supreme, Sumner held up to the living this lofty historic personage for guidance and inspiration, and with the flame of the illustrious Frenchman's sacred and unconquerable animosity to slavery, the lecturer sought to kindle to a consuming blaze the flickering opposition of the North to the American barbarism and the long-enduring tyranny of the slave power. As the term of Buchanan drew to its close and that of Lincoln to its commencement, the apprehensions of the North increased apace, and the operations of the alarmists increased apace also. The pressure put upon Congress to induce the adoption of conciliatory measures was redoubled. A Boston delegation of white-livered friends of the Union, with Edward Everett at its head, went to Washington to urge upon Northern representatives the necessity for mutual concessions in the interest of harmony and the preservation of the dear Union. Mr. Sumner has recorded how the timid old orator went to him at his lodgings, and with much emotion besought him to bring forward some conciliatory proposition, saying, "You are the only person who can introduce such a proposition with a chance of success." And Sumner has recorded his reply also. "You are mistaken in supposing that I have success with compromise," said he to the venerable time-server and trimmer. "If I could bring it forward, if I am strong with the North, it is because of the conviction that I cannot compromise. But the moment I compromised, I, too, should be lost." Thrice happy it was that at this juncture Massachusetts had not an Edward Everett in the Senate, or seated in her gubernatorial chair. In her new governor the Commonwealth found a tower of strength, while in him Sumner found a man after his own heart. Firm, indeed, was John A. Andrew against the clamor for compromise. In January 1861 he wrote Sumner in Washington, "From war, pestilence, and famine, from all assaults of the world, the flesh, and the devil, good Lord, deliver us, but most especially from any compromise with traitors or any bargain with slavery." With another time-server and trimmer, Sumner had a characteristic interview about this time. This one was James Buchanan. He had sought an audience with the President in relation to a subject touching the state of the country. When the conversation was concluded on this head, Sumner said, "Mr. President, what else can we do in Massachusetts for the good of the country?" "Much," was the reply. "What?" queried Sumner. "Adopt the Crittenden propositions," responded the Chief Magistrate. "Is that necessary?" asked the Senator with a backbone. "Yes," answered the President, who belonged unmistakably to the breed of political invertebrates. Massachusetts has not yet spoken directly, was Sumner's answer, but I feel authorized to say that such are the unalterable convictions of her people, they would see their state sunk below the sea and turned into a sandbank before they would adopt propositions acknowledging property in men and disfranchising a portion of her population. Northern compromisers, among other reactionary measures, urged the repeal or modification of the personal liberty laws in conciliation of the South. There were attempts in Massachusetts to obtain the abrogation of the laws for the protection of fugitive slaves. To William Claflin, then chairman of the Republican State Committee and president of the Senate, Sumner wrote touching this subject, "In the name of liberty, I supplicate you not to let her, Massachusetts, take any backward step, not an inch, not a hair's breadth." And to Governor Andrew he closed one of his letters with words which betray an agony of anxiety lest Massachusetts should retreat from the high ground occupied by her before the elections. "In God's name, stand firm. Don't cave, Andrew," he wrote. "Save Massachusetts from any surrender, the least." Sumner's solicitude and activity at this crisis was a potent influence in strengthening many a weak back in the legislature and making the adoption of any material concession to slavery impossible. Governor Andrews' unflinching and uncompromising front stood watch over the personal liberty laws and warded off the evil machinations of the compromisers. In February 1861, he wrote Sumner how he had made known to some persons that they could not get anything through this room, the council chamber, not conformable to certain principles and which did not contain certain details unless they marched it through by dragoons. Sumner's letters to the governor from January 17 to February 20, 1861, are eloquent of the excitement and apprehensions of the times, of the author's firmness, vigilance, and fidelity in the great cause of country and humanity. Their sustaining power was of immense account to John A. Andrew in those early and critical weeks beginning his term in the executive chair of the state. "I do not think we should allow this opportunity to pass," Sumner wrote him, "without trying the question whether a single state can break up the Union. What is it worth if held by any such tenure? And again, the question must be met on the Constitution as it is and the facts as they are, or shall we hereafter hold our government subject to this asserted right of secession? Should we yield now, and any offer is concession, every presidential election will be conducted with menace of secession by the defeated party. South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, and Alabama had already seceded and raised the standard of rebellion. Before the end of the month of January, Georgia and Louisiana were to do likewise. On the 21st, the senators of the seceding states made their dramatic exit from the Senate. Treason and the plottings of traitors filled the air of the national capital with rumors of impending violence. The panic of the compromisers in consequence grew every 24 hours in magnitude and threatened to precipitate the free states into a dishonorable retreat. On the very day that Jefferson Davis and company withdrew from the Senate, Sumner wrote Governor Andrew, "Pray keep our beloved Commonwealth firm yet a little longer, and the crisis will be past. Save her from surrender. Nothing she can do will stay secession. Impossible." And 2 days later, "Nothing that Massachusetts can do now can arrest one single state. There can be no other result except our own humiliation and a bad example which will be felt by all other states. If Massachusetts yields one hair's breadth, other states may yield an inch or a foot, a furlong or a mile." Again, a few days later, he wrote the governor, "The mistake of many persons comes from this. They do not see that we are in the midst of a revolution where reason is dethroned and passion rules instead. If this were a mere party contest, then the circulation of speeches and a few resolutions might do good. But what are such things in a revolution? As well attempt to hold a man of war in a tempest by a little anchor borrowed from Jamaica Pond. And that is what I told the Boston Committee with regard to their petition. I have but one prayer: stand firm, keep every safeguard of human rights on our statute book, and save Massachusetts glorious and true." Rumors were now flying thick of plots to seize Washington by the rebels, to convert the departments into rebel forts, etc. More than the loss of forts, Sumner's correspondence with the governor continues: "Arsenals or the national capital, I fear the loss of our principles." These are now in greatest danger. Our northern fort, Sumter, will be surrendered if you are not aroused. In my view, the vacillation of the Republicans is more fatal than that of Buchanan. And again, thus, every word of concession thus far has done infinite mischief, first by encouraging the slave masters, and secondly by demoralizing our friends and filling them with doubt and distrust. And finally, when the pressure of apprehensions began to lift from his mind and light to break through the gloom, the heart burnings and divisions showing themselves in our party a few weeks ago are none the less active. Those fatal overtures will fall to the ground. Oh, that they never had been made. Certain conciliatory propositions contained in a speech by Seward in the Senate, and made to placate the South and save the Union, were undoubtedly the fatal overtures alluded to. 4 days before Lincoln's future Secretary of State delivered the objectionable speech, he read it to Sumner, who pleaded in vain with him to omit the foolish and futile offers to the South which it contained. This period of appalling crisis and suspense, so crowded with miserable scenes of weak and vacillating leaders, so full of wretched and bootless efforts and overtures to satisfy the slave power, was abruptly terminated by the roar of cannon in Charleston harbor. It was the Southern answer to the fatal overtures of the friends of the Union. The sort of response which the North would make to the challenge was at once apparent in the tremendous popular uprising which followed the bombardment of Sumter. The Union must and shall be preserved was the mighty purpose which swept the free states together and launched them as one man against the rebellion. Sumner, as was his wont, had lingered in Washington after the close of Congress. He was in Washington when President Lincoln issued his first call for troops. There he remained, busying himself attending to public duties appertaining to him as a senator and patriot until the afternoon of April 18th, when he left for the North. At Baltimore, he got off the train and went to Barnum's Hotel, where he meant to put up for the night. That the city was in a state of unusual excitement he soon perceived. On his way from the hotel to the home of an old family friend, where he took tea and spent the evening, he found that the excitement had increased. He himself was addressed in a manner not to be mistaken. Returning that evening to the hotel, he was met by an acquaintance who enlightened him as to the object of the excitement, which had risen during the evening to the dimensions of a great mob. He was informed that it was after him, that it had already been to the hotel in quest of him. Having learned so much, he pushed on to Barnum's and called for the key of his room, when he was taken into a retired spot by the proprietor and an attaché of the hotel, and put in possession of the facts of the case, and of the danger he was in personally, and in which the house was also, from the mob, should they return again during the night. But in all that city there was no place in which Sumner could take refuge other than the hotel, and as a traveler he insisted upon his rights under the circumstances, much as he regretted the peril which his presence in the house might involve the property of the proprietor. He was then given a room in a wing of the hotel, less accessible to the mob should they attack the house during the night. The greatest secrecy was observed as to the number and location of the room occupied by Mr. Sumner, as an additional safeguard against the spirit of mischief which was abroad in the city that night, and which was to enact next day those scenes of riot, bloodshed, and treason which can never be forgotten. In the gray of the next morning, Mr. Sumner left the hotel for the Philadelphia depot, where he boarded the northward bound train. Between the two cities his train passed that which was transporting the 6th Massachusetts Regiment to the national capital. Before Sumner reached Philadelphia, the tragedy of the 19th of April, 1861, had been begun and finished in the streets of Baltimore, and the first bloodshed of the war had passed into history. On his arrival in New York, he called on Major Charles Devens and his battalion, hurrying like the then glorious 6th to the defense of the national capital. Sumner addressed the men, giving them for a watchword, Massachusetts, the Constitution, and freedom. The time for speech, however, had ended, and the time for doing and dying had come, and this no one recognized more quickly and heartily, peace advocate though he was, than Sumner. Blood and iron was the stern but simple formula for saving the Union. Blood and iron, as a recipe for destroying slavery, he believed could prove no less potent. End of chapter 12.